The city was alive in the late afternoon, a pulsing rhythm of life playing out on every corner, in every cafe, on every sidewalk. The rush of people, their feet hitting the pavement with the kind of urgency that comes when the day is closing and the weight of tomorrow presses in. The sun sank lower behind the skyline, its golden light spilling across the streets, turning glass and steel into a glowing canvas of amber and rose. It was the hour when the world felt like it was winding down, but for many, the rush only grew more frantic. People, lost in their own worlds, moved purposefully through the streets, some with heads down, others with faces lit by the soft glow of their phones, each of them absorbed in the task at hand, each of them unaware of the world beyond their own. Isaiah stood on the corner of 5th and Main, where the city's heartbeat was loudest. The streets were packed with commuters, taxis honking for space, and the endless hum of cars weaving in and out of lanes. He stood there, a mere shadow amidst the crowd, his face streaked with dirt, his small body cloaked in worn clothes that had long since given up any semblance of warmth. He wasn't tall, not by any stretch of the imagination, and his posture reflected a certain heaviness, a burden that seemed to sit on his shoulders, pressing him down with every passing minute. His hand stretched out, holding a battered piece of cardboard, the words barely legible, just a little help, please. He had learned not to expect much, a few coins, maybe, a crumpled bill left behind in a rush of disregard. The hunger gnawed at him, but he had grown accustomed to the ache. His stomach had long since given up protesting. What hurt more, what stung deeper than the hunger, was the loneliness, the invisibility. People walked past him without a glance, without a flicker of recognition. He had become part of the landscape, just another piece of the city's scenery. They moved around him, as if he weren't even there, absorbed in their own stories, in their own rush to get somewhere, anywhere. Isaiah's voice was thin, hoarse from the day's calling, a rasping whisper lost among the bustle. Please, ma'am, he murmured, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to a woman who walked by, her heels clicking against the sidewalk in rhythmic, confident steps. She was dressed in a sharp black coat, the fabric glinting as the sun dipped lower, catching the light like a polished stone. A handbag swung from her arm, sleek and expensive. Isaiah had learned to read the way people carried themselves, those with money, those who didn't have time for a kid like him. Just a little for food, he said, quieter now, almost apologetically. But she didn't stop. Her gaze flickered to him, a momentary glance, just long enough for him to see the look in her eyes. It wasn't the pity he'd come to expect, nor was it the indifference that was so common. No, this look was colder, sharper, a flash of disgust that cut deeper than anything else he'd experienced. Don't touch me, she snapped, recoiling as if his mere presence had sullied the air. You filthy thing. Do you know how much this coat costs? It's worth more than your entire life. Isaiah's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words heavier than anything else he'd ever known. And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd, lost to the evening rush. Isaiah had long ago learned the rhythm of the city, a pulse that beat with the same regularity as the ticking of a clock, yet felt so distant and foreign. It was a rhythm of motion, never still, never quiet. The streets never stopped. There was always someone walking, always someone rushing to the next destination, always someone too busy to notice anything outside their narrow world. And Isaiah, for as long as he could remember, had existed at the edges of it all, invisible, silent, a quiet part of the backdrop of the city's hustle. As the days blended into one another, he came to understand the subtle ways of survival on the streets. It wasn't enough to simply exist. You had to blend in, become a part of the noise, a shadow in the periphery, a face in the crowd that nobody bothered to really see. So, he stood on the corner, day after day, hands extended but never fully expecting to be seen. The street was his stage, and yet he played no part in it. His role was one of silence, one of waiting. It was easier that way. Sometimes, he would see other street dwellers, people who had learned to shout louder, who had learned to ask for help with a more desperate intensity. They would shout. They would cry out for food or for change. But Isaiah had learned early on that such demands often resulted in nothing but scorn. He had seen it too many times, people hurriedly walking past, pretending not to hear, or worse, casting him looks that seemed to say, "You're not even worth acknowledging." So, he kept his voice low, a quiet murmur, a soft plea that barely carried above the noise of the world. He had grown to understand the city's indifference, the way it seemed to swallow up anything it didn't deem important. But there were moments, fleeting, rare, that he allowed himself to dream. Dream of a life where he wasn't invisible, where he didn't have to stand on the corner with a hand outstretched, hoping for a crumb to fall his way. It was hard not to imagine something different, something better, even though deep down he knew it was a far-off fantasy. Yet, even in the face of all that coldness, there was something inside him, a spark of hope, maybe, or perhaps just the will to survive, that refused to be completely extinguished. He watched the people around him, the well-dressed men and women, striding by with purpose, their lives full of things he would never know. He would catch glimpses of their faces, flushed from the day's work, the stress, the smiles as they greeted each other, oblivious to the boys standing at their feet. They didn't see him, they couldn't see him, and that was fine. Isaiah had learned long ago that it didn't matter. He would survive, because that was all he knew how to do. The world was busy, moving forward without a second thought for the ones it left behind. But still, Isaiah stood on the corner, waiting for the city's pulse to beat in his favor, if only for a moment. It was strange, really, how people could be so close to each other and yet feel so far apart. Isaiah watched the people pass by, their faces hurried, focused, as though the world around them was nothing but a blur. Each face was a puzzle, a brief flicker of emotion before it vanished into the crowd. There were some faces that wore the marks of a hard day's work, their brows furrowed in concentration, lips tight in frustration. Others had faces that were lost in the soft glow of their smartphones, fingers swiping quickly, oblivious to the world around them. But no matter the expression, no matter the person, one thing remained constant: the indifference. Isaiah had learned to read people, to understand the tiny gestures that told him whether they'd notice him or ignore him. A look, a shift in posture, a glance toward his outstretched hand, the subtle ways people let him know, without a word, that he wasn't worth their time. Some would look at him for just a second, their gaze sharp and dismissive, as though he were a stain on the sidewalk, something to be avoided. Others would look past him, their eyes fixed firmly on whatever else they were doing, as if his presence didn't even register in their peripheral vision. It hurt, but not in the way you might expect. It wasn't a sharp, immediate pain. It was more like the dull ache of being forgotten, of not mattering. Sometimes, it felt as though he was invisible, not even a part of the city's pulse, just a shadow in the corner, ignored and unnoticed. The faces around him were always moving, always busy, too busy to spare a moment to look at the boys standing on the corner, hoping for a bit of kindness. Isaiah had learned to accept it. At first, the rejection stung. It was hard to face the coldness of people, to see how easily they could ignore his hunger, his need, his humanity. But over time, he had built a wall around himself, a wall of silence and patience. He stood there, day after day, hands outstretched, asking for nothing more than a moment of someone's time, a small gesture of humanity. But more often than not, the world kept moving around him, a tide that he could never seem to catch. Still, he didn't give up. Even in the face of all that indifference, Isaiah kept standing there, waiting, hoping, because in the back of his mind, there was always that small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would notice him. Maybe, just maybe, someone would see him, not as a beggar, but as a person. It was in the quiet moments, when the noise of the city seemed to fade just a little, that Isaiah would catch himself hoping, not for much, just a spark, a glimpse of something better, something different. His eyes would scan the crowd, hoping to see someone who might look at him, truly see him, in a way that the others never did. And then, as if the universe had decided to grant him a brief reprieve, his gaze landed on her. She was walking toward him, a woman in a bright red coat, the fabric catching the light of the setting sun. The glow made her appear almost ethereal, like something out of a dream. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, each step a cadence of confidence, of power. She moved with purpose, her head held high, her face framed by perfectly styled hair. There was something in the way she carried herself, something that spoke of a life that was far removed from Isaiah's own. Yet, in that moment, as she passed by, she looked up, and their eyes met. Isaiah froze, his heart skipping a beat. Her gaze lingered just a little longer than most, just long enough for him to feel the faintest glimmer of hope stir inside him. Maybe she would help him, just this once. Maybe she would see the boy in front of her and not turn away with disdain. Maybe. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was hoarse from disuse, barely a whisper against the clamor of the street. But he stepped forward anyway, the cardboard still clutched in his hand. Just a little help for food. It's been days. He didn't expect much. Maybe a coin or two. Maybe even some leftover food she had from lunch. But hope, fragile and fleeting, bloomed in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him brave enough to ask. The woman stopped. Her eyes flicked down to him, scanning him quickly. And for a moment, Isaiah just thought, that maybe, just maybe, there was kindness in her eyes. But it was fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, her expression unreadable. Her gaze seemed to linger on the dirt smeared across his cheeks, the raggedness of his clothes, the worn-out shoes. Then, without a word, her face hardened. Isaiah's heart sank before she even spoke. "Don't touch me, you filthy thing." The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. She recoiled, pulling back so quickly that Isaiah barely had time to process the venom in her voice. Her eyes were narrowed, her lip curled in disgust. "This coat," she sneered, "costs more than you'll ever see in your miserable life." The word stung, sharper than any physical blow. It wasn't the insult itself, it was the way she said it, with such finality, such coldness, as though his very existence was an inconvenience, something to be repelled at all costs. Isaiah stood there, frozen, the cardboard still in his hand. The brief spark of hope that had flared up inside him flickered out in an instant, leaving him feeling colder than ever. He watched as she turned and walked away, her heels clicking steadily on the pavement, each step further away from him, from the possibility he dared to dream for just a moment. The city moved around him, just as it always had. The rush of the evening continued, the faces passing by, the cars honking, the world spinning on, unaware of the boy standing alone in the growing darkness. For a brief moment, everything around Isaiah seemed to slow down. The rush of cars, the hum of distant conversations, even the soft shuffle of feet on the sidewalk, they all faded into a quiet backdrop, leaving just him and her. His breath caught in his throat as he took a step closer, the cardboard trembling slightly in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman slowed her pace, her eyes briefly flicking to his outstretched hand, then back to his face. For a heartbeat, there was hope. It hung between them, fragile and delicate, like the softest thread ready to snap at the slightest pull. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. She didn't smile. She didn't pause to take a second look. Instead, her gaze flickered downward for an instant, her fingers instinctively tightening around the strap of her designer handbag. The briefest hint of discomfort crossed her face, and she shifted her gaze to the sidewalk ahead of her, never truly meeting his eyes again. Her heels clicked against the pavement once more, faster this time. As she moved on, Isaiah felt the weight of it, the swift dismissal. It wasn't harsh, not in the way that some had been. There was no cruel word, no harsh rebuke, but the rejection stung in a deeper way, in a way that felt like being invisible again. Even when someone had seen him for a moment, he stood there, his outstretched hand still held out in the air for a second, unsure of what to do with it. As he dropped his hand slowly, the city's pulse surged back around him. The cars honked, the footsteps quickened, and the crowd carried on, as if nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. She had simply kept walking. Isaiah's shoulders sagged, and the faintest sigh escaped his lips. He had become so accustomed to this, to the faces that glanced at him and then looked away. Each rejection, no matter how small, chipped away at something inside him. It wasn't just the absence of kindness, it was the feeling of being forgotten, the sense that his life, his struggle, didn't matter enough to slow the pace of someone's day. But still, he didn't leave the corner. He couldn't. It was all he knew. And somewhere, buried beneath the hurt, there remained that fragile hope, that glimmer that maybe, just maybe, the next person would be different. The next person might stop. The minutes stretched on like hours, each one heavier than the last. Isaiah stood motionless at the corner, his eyes fixed on the space where the woman had just been, his hands still aching from the brief hope that had slipped through his fingers. The world around him continued to move, but he remained frozen, caught between the city's unrelenting rush and his own quiet devastation. He hadn't expected much. Not really. A coin. Maybe. Just enough to ease the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. But it was the silence that lingered longer than anything else. The silence of being unnoticed, of being left behind, of being a shadow in a world that only seemed to care about the people who had enough. Isaiah's eyes swept over the crowd again. Faces blurred together. Too many people. Too many lives. None of them interested in his. His hand fell to his side, and the piece of cardboard crumpled slightly under his fingers. The cardboard had become familiar in his grasp, its rough edges softening over time. Its words now a faded memory. Just a little help, he had written. But nobody seemed to hear. The evening was growing darker now, the last of the sunlight slipping behind the horizon, leaving the city awash in a cold, blue twilight. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting harsh, yellow glows onto the sidewalk, illuminating the cracks in the pavement, the litter, and the lonely figures like Isaiah who had nowhere to go. He turned his gaze downward, toward the worn shoes on his feet, the soles thinning with each step. They had once been new, or at least new enough. Now, they were just another part of the struggle, another thing that had worn out long before its time. He wondered, briefly, if she had even noticed his shoes, if the woman in the red coat had seen how they barely fit him anymore, how they were too small, too ragged. The crowd around him had thinned. Rush hour was fading, the evening settling into a quieter rhythm. People were going home, heading to dinner, to the comfort of their own lives. But Isaiah wasn't going anywhere. He had no place to go, no home to return to. The street was both his world and his prison. For a long time, he stood there, watching the people go by, each one a brief, flickering light in his life. Some of them might have seen him, might have even felt a fleeting pang of guilt, but none of them stopped. None of them offered the smallest act of kindness. He had learned, over time, that hope wasn't something that could be relied upon. Hope, like everything else on the streets, was fleeting, a mirage in the distance that you could chase, but never quite reach. Isaiah had become a master of blending into the background. It was a skill born from necessity, honed over years of quiet observation. He'd learned that in the vast sea of humanity that filled the streets of the city, the key to survival wasn't shouting for attention. It was vanishing into the crowd, becoming a part of it, unnoticed and small. The less people saw you, the less they felt compelled to offer help, but the less they'd push you away with disgust or fear. It was a strange balance, this dance of invisibility. But as the city buzzed around him, he began to wonder, how many people like him were there in the crowd? How many others had learned to wear their invisibility like a second skin, never quite fitting into the world around them, but moving through it anyway? He looked at the faces around him again. There was a man sitting on the curb near a coffee shop, his hands shaking as he cupped a half-drunk cup of stale coffee. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, his eyes were clouded, lost somewhere between the past and the present. No one stopped to help him. No one paused long enough to wonder if he was hungry, or cold, or if he even had a place to sleep tonight. A young woman walked by with her earbuds in, her head bobbing to some silent rhythm that only she could hear. She didn't see the homeless man, or Isaiah, or anyone else around her. She was in her own world, a world where nothing outside her headphones mattered. Her focus was fixed on her screen, her thoughts somewhere else, somewhere far away from the streets, from the reality of the people standing right next to her. The city was filled with invisible people, like him, scattered all around. They were there, standing on corners, sitting in doorways, drifting through crowds. They weren't part of the city's pulse. They didn't move in the same rhythms as everyone else. They were the forgotten ones, the ones who had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed and unspoken for. Isaiah sighed, but the sigh wasn't a release, it was a realization. The city was indifferent, yes, but it was indifferent to so many things. It wasn't just him. It was the old man with the scruffy gray beard, the woman in the torn coat, the children who walked barefoot through the streets. It was a whole world of invisible lives, all woven together, all unnoticed. And for a moment, Isaiah wondered if they would ever be seen, if they would ever matter to the world beyond the street corners and the busy intersections. Would anyone ever stop long enough to see the people who didn't belong? Or would they just keep walking, oblivious, until the next rush hour came? He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the city wash over him, the honking of the horns, the chatter of people, the click-clack of high heels. It was all part of the symphony of the evening. And yet, for him, it felt like background noise. The world was full of people who were seen, who were heard, who mattered. He was just one of the forgotten ones. But maybe, just maybe, someone would notice him someday. Maybe someone would see the boy in the shadows and stop long enough to offer him not just coins, but a glance, a word, a piece of kindness in a city that seemed to have forgotten how to be kind. Isaiah tightened his grip on the cardboard again, his fingers pressing into its rough surface. The city would keep moving, but for now, he would stand still. He would wait, and perhaps, when the time was right, someone would finally see him. Isaiah shifted on the corner, his feet sore from standing too long, but his mind stayed restless, flickering like the neon signs overhead. The night had deepened, and the streets had taken on a colder edge. People still moved past him, their faces sharp in the harsh light of the street lamps. But something felt different tonight. There was an unspoken shift in the air, a subtle change in the usual rhythm of the city. For the first time in what felt like forever, Isaiah wasn't the only one who seemed to notice it. It was a woman, but not the one from earlier. This woman was older, her hair streaked with silver and tucked under a woolen scarf, her coat a faded gray that had seen better days. She walked slowly, her steps cautious but deliberate. Her eyes, soft and kind, moved over the crowd with the kind of quiet attentiveness that Isaiah had almost forgotten existed. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, she turned and looked directly at him. At first, Isaiah froze, unsure if he had imagined it. People didn't look at him like that. They didn't look with empathy, with an open heart. They looked away, or worse, they turned their heads as if he were some kind of inconvenience, a disruption in their perfect, controlled lives. But this woman, this stranger, looked at him with a kindness that felt almost foreign. She hesitated for just a moment, as though she were weighing something in her mind. Then she walked toward him, her footsteps measured and calm. Isaiah's heart quickened, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't move, afraid that if he did, he might disturb the fragile thread of connection that had suddenly formed between them. When she reached him, she didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, a few feet away, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, as if taking a moment to see him, really see him. Isaiah wasn't sure what to say, his words lost somewhere in the sudden rush of emotions. For a moment, there was nothing but the noise of the city, the distant hum of car engines, the murmur of conversations, and the silence that hung between them. And then, she spoke. "How long has it been?" Her voice was soft, steady, like a gentle breeze breaking the stillness. Isaiah blinked, caught off guard by her question. "What?" he managed, his voice hoarse, unsure of what she meant. "How long since you've had a meal?" she asked again, her gaze still fixed on him. "How long since you've been able to sit down, to eat something warm?" Isaiah swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't even realized how badly he was trembling, how the weight of his hunger had taken over his body, how long it had been since he had been treated like more than just a shadow on the sidewalk. "A few days," he whispered, barely able to meet her eyes. She nodded, then reached into her bag, pulling out a crumpled bill and some change. "I don't have much," she said, her voice tinged with an apology, "but it's enough to get you a warm meal. Take it, please." Isaiah stood still, his hand frozen in the air for a moment, unsure if he could trust what was happening. No one ever gave like this, not without expecting something in return, not without passing judgment, not without looking at him like he was beneath them. But there was no judgment in her eyes, no disgust, no hurriedness, just a quiet understanding, as if she knew what it felt like to be forgotten. Tentatively, he reached for the money, his fingers brushing against hers for a split second, a moment of connection that felt real, that felt human. He stared down at the bill in his hand, then back up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said, the words thick with something he couldn't quite name. She gave him a small, sad smile. "You're welcome," she said softly, before turning and walking away, leaving Isaiah standing there in the quiet glow of the street lamp. For the first time in a long time, Isaiah didn't feel invisible. The city still moved around him, still pulsed with its relentless rhythm. But in that one moment, he had been seen, and somehow, that was enough to make him believe, just for a little while longer, that maybe things could be different. For a long moment, Isaiah stood still, unsure of what was happening. The woman, though standing quietly, seemed to be searching his face, as if trying to read the story that had been written in his eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly aware of his ragged clothes, his dirt-smeared face, the faint scent of sweat and the stale air that clung to him. He was a boy standing on a street corner, a nobody, a shadow in a crowd. But she didn't look at him with pity. No, it wasn't pity in her eyes, but something else, something softer, something real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. "You look like you could use some help." Isaiah blinked, caught off guard, his lips parted, but no words came out at first. He had asked for help before, but never like this, never from someone who had stopped, really stopped, and seen him, not as a nuisance, not as a problem, but simply as another person, in need of something he could not provide for himself. The woman took a small step closer, and from inside her purse, she pulled out a folded bill, crisp and new. She didn't hold it out immediately, but offered it in a way that felt like a question, as if she were giving him the chance to accept her kindness, not as charity, but as an act of shared humanity. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the bill in her hand, but it was the weight of her gesture that struck him the hardest. No words were exchanged for several long seconds. He wasn't sure if he should take it, if he deserved it, if it was even real. He had grown so used to rejection, to being ignored. That kindness felt almost like a foreign language. But then, he found his voice, quiet and uncertain. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words felt inadequate, too small to carry the weight of what he was feeling. She smiled softly, her eyes warm. "You're welcome," she said, and then, before Isaiah could say anything else, she turned and walked away. Isaiah watched her go, the crisp bill now safely tucked in his pocket. But the true gift she had given him was not the money. It was something deeper, something more profound. She had seen him, really seen him, for the first time in a long time. Someone had stopped, acknowledged his existence, and treated him with dignity. And in that brief exchange, something in him shifted. Isaiah stood there for a while after she had gone, his hands still in his pocket, his heart light. The city around him had not changed. People still rushed by, lost in their own worlds. But for Isaiah, the world had opened up just a little wider. For once, he wasn't invisible. For once, he had mattered. Isaiah took a deep breath, the weight of the moment hanging in the cool night air. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he accepted the bill from her hand. It wasn't just the money that made his heart race, though. It was the act itself. It was the way she had seen him, truly seen him, without judgment, without hesitation. For that brief, fleeting moment, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't a problem to be ignored or a nuisance to be avoided. He was a person, just like her, a person deserving of dignity, The woman smiled softly as Isaiah looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice warm but firm, as though she were giving him something far greater than a bill, something even more precious. "Respect?" She turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. Isaiah stood frozen, watching her go, the crumpled bill still warm in his hand. He wanted to say something, anything, to thank her, but the words caught in his throat. It didn't matter, though. In that brief exchange, she had given him more than just money. She had given him a piece of his humanity back, reminding him that no one was truly invisible, that no one was beyond compassion. For the first time in a long while, Isaiah didn't feel alone. As the city continued to hum with its endless rhythm, Isaiah allowed himself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that even in the midst of indifference, kindness still had a place. Even in a world that seemed to pass by without a second thought, there was always room for connection. Real, honest, human connection. And that, he realized, was the most valuable thing of all. The lesson: in a world that often feels too busy, too distracted, or too indifferent to notice the struggles of others, kindness can still break through. It doesn't always come from grand gestures or dramatic acts. Sometimes, it's as simple as seeing someone, really seeing them, and offering what little you can to make their day a bit easier, a bit brighter. Isaiah's story teaches us that even the smallest acts of kindness can restore a person's sense of worth, and that no matter how invisible we may feel, we all have the capacity to make the world a little less lonely for someone else. In the end, it's not the money or the material things that matter, but the recognition of our shared humanity. That's what connects us, and that's what makes us whole.